A few thousand Australians dug into the sand at Tobruk found themselves surrounded by nearly 20,000 German soldiers, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the might of Rommel's Afrika Korps, led by the feared Desert Fox himself. The world believed Tobruk would fall in a matter of days, but what actually happened would defy every expectation. The year was 1941. The Second World War had already spread across Europe, Asia, and the seas. In North Africa, the fighting was fierce, brutal, and relentless. This wasn't just about territory. It was about controlling vital supply routes, oil, and access to the Mediterranean. Whoever won in the desert could shift the balance of power across an entire theater of war. Into this battlefield stepped one of Hitler's most celebrated generals, Erwin Rommel. Known to both friend and foe as the Desert Fox, Rommel was a master of speed and surprise. His Afrika Korps had earned a reputation for striking hard and fast, overwhelming Allied forces before they even had time to regroup. In just weeks, his troops pushed the British and their Commonwealth allies back across the Libyan desert. To many, it looked like victory for the Axis was only a matter of time. But the Allies had one last card to play, the port town of Tobruk. Situated on the Libyan coast, Tobruk was more than just another fortress. It was a lifeline. From Tobruk's harbor, supplies, fuel, and reinforcements could be received directly from the sea. And for Rommel, capturing Tobruk was not just desirable, it was absolutely essential. Without it, his advance risked grinding to a halt. His tanks and trucks needed fuel. His soldiers needed food and ammunition. Holding Tobruk meant survival. Losing Tobruk meant collapse. Inside the defenses were about 14,000 Allied troops. Among them were 9,000 Australians, joined by British, Indian, and Polish forces. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and far from home. Yet they had orders to hold the line no matter the cost. For these men, surrender was not an option. Rommel, on the other hand, had nearly 20,000 soldiers at his disposal. He had the advantage in numbers. He had the advantage in tanks. And he had the advantage in the air, with the Luftwaffe dominating the skies. On paper, there was no contest. Every military analyst, every strategist, every observer expected Tobruk to collapse within days of the German assault. The defenders were seen as little more than a speed bump in the Desert Fox AS unstoppable march. But history has a way of defying expectations. While Rommel prepared for a swift victory, the Australians and their comrades were preparing for something very different. They knew their survival depended not on open battle, but on turning Tobruk into an unbreakable fortress. They dug deep into the desert soil, creating a maze of trenches, dugouts, and bunkers. Artillery pieces were hidden beneath camouflage nets. Machine gun nests were concealed within the sand and rock. Every inch of Tobruk was transformed into a trap waiting for the enemy. The conditions were brutal. By day, the desert sun scorched everything in sight, making even the simplest task exhausting. By night, temperatures plummeted, leaving soldiers shivering in their holes. Food and water were rationed, medical supplies were limited. Morale was constantly tested by the endless whine of enemy aircraft overhead. Yet, in these harsh and unforgiving conditions, the Australians earned a reputation for resilience. They refused to give in to despair. Instead, they prepared themselves for the fight of their lives. Rommel underestimated this determination. To him, the defenders were a nuisance, something to be crushed quickly before moving on to bigger victories. But the longer Tobruk held out, the greater the strain on his forces. Every day spent outside Tobruk was a day without supplies flowing freely. Every failed assault meant more casualties, more lost equipment, more frustration. The Germans were supposed to be the hunters in the desert. Instead, around Tobruk, they found themselves facing defenders who simply would not break. This was the stage upon which the siege was set. Two forces, one known for speed, power, and overwhelming strength, the other for stubbornness, grit, and a refusal to surrender, were about to clash in one of the most extraordinary battles of the war. The world was watching, and in the dust and heat of North Africa, a legend was about to be born. On the morning of April 10, 1941, Rommel made his move. German tanks rumbled forward, supported by infantry and artillery. Dust clouds rose over the desert as the Afrika Korps advanced, confident that Tobruk would fall quickly. For the Australians waiting in their trenches, it was the moment of truth. The attack came hard and fast. Panzer divisions led the charge, their cannons firing into the defenses. Behind them marched German infantry, disciplined and determined. Overhead, the Luftwaffe screamed across the sky, dropping bombs that shook the earth. The full force of modern mechanized warfare was unleashed on a small garrison of men, clinging to a dusty fortress. But Tobruk did not collapse. Instead, it roared back to life. As German tanks pushed closer, hidden anti-tank guns opened fire. Many of these weapons were carefully dug into the sand, invisible until the moment they struck. The first German assault was ripped apart by explosions as panzers burst into flames. Infantry advancing behind the armor found themselves caught in withering crossfire from machine guns and rifles. Rommel's men had expected a quick victory. What they found was a wall of resistance. The Australians had prepared for this moment. Their trenches were not simple holes in the ground. They were an interconnected system, stretching for miles, designed to absorb bombardments and launch counterattacks. Soldiers lived underground, moving through tunnels from one position to another. They endured days of shelling without breaking, and when the Germans advanced, they rose up to meet them. As the siege dragged on, life inside Tobruk became a test of endurance. Supplies were limited. Meals often consisted of little more than bully beef, hard biscuits, and tea brewed from whatever water could be spared. Fresh vegetables and fruit were almost unheard of. The men grew thin and weary, but their determination only hardened. German propaganda sought to break their spirit. Radio broadcasts mocked the defenders, calling them the rats of Tobruk because they lived in burrows and tunnels like vermin. But instead of being insulted, the Australians adopted the name with pride. They wore it as a badge of honor, proof that they could survive in the harshest conditions and still defy one of the greatest armies in the world. The fighting was relentless. Day after day, Rommel launched new assaults, probing for weaknesses in the defenses. Night after night, the Australians repaired their trenches, reset their guns, and prepared for the next attack. When German tanks breached the outer lines, they were met with grenades, Molotov cocktails, and close-quarters combat. When the Luftwaffe pounded the fortress, the men dug deeper, emerging once the dust settled to fire back. No matter what Rommel threw at them, the defenders refused to yield. One of the most remarkable aspects of the siege was the sheer courage displayed by ordinary soldiers. Men who had never left their towns in Australia found themselves halfway across the world, fighting in a desert they had never imagined. They faced thirst, hunger, exhaustion, and constant danger. Yet stories of bravery spread through the ranks, soldiers manning guns until they overheated, stretcher bearers carrying the wounded through enemy fire, commanders rallying their men in the darkest hours. Each day they held out was a victory in itself. The siege dragged on far longer than anyone had predicted. Weeks turned into months. Rommel expected Tobruk to fall quickly, but instead he found himself locked in a battle of attrition. Every failed assault drained his strength. Every delay cost him time and supplies. The Australians were not only holding Tobruk, they were tying down one of the most feared generals of the war, preventing him from advancing further into Egypt and threatening the Suez Canal. Inside Tobruk, the men joked that they were forgotten by the world, but outside, news of their defiance spread like wildfire. Headlines in Britain, Australia, and beyond celebrated the rats of Tobruk as heroes. They became a symbol of resilience, of courage under fire, of what it meant to fight against impossible odds and refuse to break. By the height of summer in 1941, Tobruk had become a nightmare for the Germans. The heat was unbearable, the dust storms constant, and the defenders stubborn beyond belief. Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox was still formidable, but here, in front of Tobruk's battered walls, even he could not claim an easy victory. The siege was not yet over, but by mid-1941, one thing was clear. The Australians had already achieved the impossible. They had stood firm against overwhelming force. They had turned an insult into a legend, and they had shown the world that even in the most desperate circumstances, determination could hold back the tide. By the middle of 1941, Tobruk had already become a symbol. What was supposed to be a quick German victory had turned into a drawn-out ordeal. The Australians and their allies had endured months of constant shelling, air raids and assaults, yet the fortress still stood. Rommel, the master of desert warfare, had been checked. The siege ultimately lasted for 240 days, almost 8 long months. For the men inside Tobruk, time felt endless. They lived underground, slept in dust-filled dugouts, and fought from trenches that became their second homes. They faced not only the enemy, but also disease, flies, and the harsh desert climate. Yet somehow morale held. Jokes were told. Songs were sung. The nickname Rats of Tobruk, once hurled as an insult, was embraced with pride. The defenders had turned mockery into identity. Outside the fortress, the wider war continued. In Britain, newspapers printed stories of the Australians' stand celebrating their courage. Across the Commonwealth, people followed the siege closely, inspired by the idea that ordinary men from places like Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth were defying one of Hitler's greatest generals. At a time when the Allies had suffered defeat after defeat, Tobruk became a rare beacon of hope. Rommel, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated. Every day his forces spent trying to capture Tobruk was a day he could not advance eastward into Egypt. His supply lines stretched thin. His soldiers grew weary. The longer the siege dragged on, the more the balance of power shifted. Tobruk had become more than just a fortress. It was a thorn in the side of the Axis campaign in North Africa. Finally, in December 1941, relief came. British forces launched Operation Crusader, a large-scale offensive designed to break the siege. After weeks of heavy fighting, Rommel was forced to pull back. The garrison at Tobruk was relieved. The defenders, those who had endured months of bombardment, hunger, and isolation, marched out not as victims but as victors. They had survived against the odds. They had done what few thought possible. The legacy of Tobruk was immediate and lasting. Militarily, the defense delayed Rommel's advance and bought precious time for the Allies to regroup. Strategically, it showed that the Afrika Korps could be stopped. And psychologically, it gave hope to nations that desperately needed a victory to rally around. For the Germans, the failure to take Tobruk was a rare and humbling setback in the Desert War. For the Australians, it was a defining moment in their military history. But beyond the strategy and the headlines, the story of Tobruk is, at its heart, a story of resilience. It is the story of men who refuse to surrender, even when surrounded, outnumbered, and written off by the world. It is the story of how determination and courage can hold back overwhelming force. And it is the story of how an insult, rats, became a symbol of pride remembered for generations to come. Today, the name Rats of Tobruk still carries weight. Monuments, memorials, and stories passed down remind us of what was achieved in that dusty fortress in 1941. Veterans who survived the siege carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. Proud of what they endured and what they accomplished together, their stand was not just about holding a port. It was about proving that even in the darkest times, defiance and unity can change the course of history. The siege of Tobruk ended, but its lessons remain. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, yet never defeated, the Rats of Tobruk will forever stand as a reminder of courage against impossible odds.